The Black unemployment rate surged in August, while every other group saw a drop. According to experts, the Black unemployment rate was 8.8%, which is 69% higher than the national average. The Black rate last month in relationship to the national rate was similar to figures during the Great Recession. Wow, this is really depressing news. And today we are asking, is this all just a mere coincidence? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
The August jobs report was largely underwhelming, if not a complete failure, especially for Black workers. Now, President Biden blames it on the Delta variant, but whatever the cause, that report showed that the Black unemployment rate surged last month, while joblessness for every other group fell. As of Friday of last week, the Black unemployment rate stood at 8.8%. That rate was 8.2% in July. Both rates are evidence that unemployment rates are trending in the wrong direction for Black folks. Meanwhile, the white unemployment rate dropped to a record low of 4.5%. The rising unemployment rate impacted Black men, women, and youth. But Black women have had an especially hard time and an even harder time than other African Americans seeking employment. So the question we're asking today is, do employers really want the economy to have a post-COVID recovery, a surge, as we've heard so much about? And do they really want to hire employees? Or do they just want to hire workers as long as those workers are not Black? Here for my first segment is Dr. Kristen Broady. She's an economist, a fellow at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, and a professor of financial economics on leave from Dillard University. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Dr. Broady.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I started this segment saying these numbers are really, really depressing. When you think about the Black unemployment rate and, the job report for across the board, we know was pretty underwhelming. The White House had predicted somewhere around 750,000 jobs would be created in August. That number was actually, closer to 230,000 or so. But were you at all surprised when that job report showed, such a big, number in terms of the percentage of African Americans who are unemployed?
So it's funny that you should ask. I did another podcast last week, and the host said that economists predicted that there was going to be this big surge. And I'm like, not all economists, right? Like, I have been underwhelmed each time. And I guess I'm not sure what anybody else is looking at, but things that I've considered are, one, the Delta variant. Who has COVID been affecting all along at a disproportionate rate? Black people and Native American people particularly, in addition to Latino and Hispanic people. Who has always had the highest unemployment rate? Like, I'm so happy that news media is now starting to look at the disaggregation of these numbers. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics started tracking this data by race in like 1972. And since then, the Black unemployment rate has always been the highest. People are now starting to talk about it, happily enough. I think we could also talk about telework. Who has the ability to telework? Who is more likely to get the vaccine? Who's more likely to be able to afford childcare? All of those things play into this disparity that we're seeing now.
And I'm glad you mentioned the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the fact that they started tracking the unemployment rate for African Americans back in 1972. And we know that we weren't going through a pandemic in 1972. We didn't have the Delta variant in 1972. But yet historically, since that time frame, 1972, the Black unemployment rate has always been twice as high in some cases as that of the white unemployment rate. Help us understand, not today, because yes, the COVID vaccines, all of that play a role, but when you're looking at 72 and 82 and 92 and all these years, where there is no pandemic, what was going on?
I think there've always been reasons, right? Like you had the housing crisis, right? And so we know that Black people were disproportionately given subprime loans. We know that their homes are worth less. We know that recessions and depressions throughout history have hurt Black people more. That when the U.S. Gets a cold, Black people get the flu, right? Like we've heard all of these statements. And so what is that really? It's structural racism, right? Like there have been these bubbles and recoveries, and then Black people have always, throughout all of it, had the highest unemployment rate. Our houses are valued at less. Our income is less. We have less wealth. We're less likely to get a college education and pay more in terms of loans for that education. And so we can talk about all of these things separately, but ultimately it all comes together to structural racism. And as long as we have racism in this country, these issues are not going to be fixed. We can work to resolve them, but the issue that needs to be fixed is racism.
We often hear this in the context of politics, and you'll hear Republican talking points, saying African Americans, really need to look at how we vote, that we have consistently voted for Democratic, candidates, and yet through these Democratic administrations at the federal level and oftentimes through the state level, you have this persistent problem. So this issue you just identified as structural racism, obviously. This rate hasn't changed much since 1972, whether you've had a Black president, whether you've had a Democratic president or a Republican president. Help us understand how, administrations that are, typically more favorable to Black folks in particular have still suffered from these same, really horrific job numbers.
Yeah, so I think that we have seen improvements. We saw improvements under President Obama. We're seeing improvements under President Biden, but it's not just about the jobs numbers, and a president can't end racism. Having a Black president doesn't end racism, especially when you think about the things that were said about President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama, that even with who they were, even with all of their degrees and education and qualifications and skills and experience and even being the president, it didn't stop racism.
Right. Yeah, and I'm not so naive as to think that one person, can end structural racism, but you do think, or would think, I think it's intuitive, that policies implemented by, a Black president or a Democratic president or a progressive president would cause there to be, some huge, not minor blip, but some huge shift in these numbers.
Yeah, and I guess I don't think so, and I can give you some reasons why. And again, I'm not saying that President Obama's administration didn't have positive effects. I try not to get into politics too much working at the Brookings Institution, but I guess I want to talk about these telework numbers, because I think it goes to the kinds of jobs that people are in, right? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics looks at through the current population survey, these questions on telework, right? And so if we look back in May of 2020, okay, when they first started tracking this, 35.4% of workers aged 16 and older teleworked. Among white workers, the number was 35.3 compared to 51.9 for Asian American, only 29.3 for Black workers, and only 23% of Latino workers. So the people that could telework didn't have a gap, right? Like they continued to be unemployed. They were working at home. They were saving money. They weren't traveling for business. So they could have been doing even better financially. Now, if we jump to August 2021, 13.4% of the working age population teleworked. And so the numbers were 12.4% for white, 11.2 for Black, 30.4 for Asian American workers, and only 7.9 for Latino. Right. So like that, those are the kind of numbers that to me, like really tell a story of who could continue working without interruption in their salary. If we look at Go on, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
why is the number so high for Asian workers? Is that because where they're clustered in terms of the workforce?
Yes. And so I think it goes to the types of jobs that people are clustered in. And Black and Hispanic workers are overrepresented in customer facing jobs that we call essential and that are at a higher risk of being automated as well. So during the pandemic, many companies who could automated things, right? Like we see more automatic checkout machines.
Mhm.
We see less jobs in some areas, cashiers for people to even come back to, right? Where if you look at the people that are concentrated in tech jobs or thought jobs where you think for a living or advise or, you know, where your job is based on critical thinking, yeah, those jobs didn't go away. And so I think these numbers are telling that we see that white and Asian Americans are more concentrated in those jobs than are Black and Hispanic workers. That's part of the reason why we see the problem that we see now, in addition to vaccine numbers and child care and all of those things. Like they all go together.
Yeah, and I know your Brookings Institute actually did a study and found that the unemployment rate for African Americans is worse in majority Black metropolitan areas. I didn't understand that. So you look at, you know, predominantly Black cities. I guess the thinking would be there are more Black employers in those cities, so you wouldn't have the same level of structural racial issues that would prevent Blacks from finding jobs. But that's not true based on your
But there have to be businesses and jobs for them to find, right? And so we know that Black businesses are more likely than white businesses to be sole proprietorships. So they just have one person. They don't have the ability, the financial ability to hire somebody else, right? So even if you do have more Black businesses in a Black neighborhood, if they're sole proprietorships, then they're not hiring people, right? And so we need to invest in these businesses so that they can do that. But that means, how do they go about getting loans? Black businesses have a more difficult time getting approved for a loan from the bank in the first place. There are less banks in Black neighborhoods, right? And they're not Black banks. We've seen the number of Black banks decrease. So it's like, who are these businesses going to get a business loan? They're going to white banks, white commercial banks that are less likely to give them a loan so that they can build their business and hire people in their neighborhood, in their community, who
Well,
look like them or not. So
D.C. was one of the cities that was quoted as having an unemployment rate of 6 times higher than the white rate. So again, you think of D.C., you know, automatically think of the government and the potential for there to be lots of government jobs, both federal jobs as well as, you know, local, you know, jobs created by that district. Why is the unemployment rate in a city like, you know, the District of Columbia 6 times higher for African Americans than it is
there's
for?
still a matter of the qualifications, right? Like when you look at some of these government jobs, the application process that you have to go through, the vetting that you have to go through, you can't have a criminal record and you can't have smoked marijuana in how many ever years. You've got to have how many ever recommendations. And, you know, there are things that everybody doesn't meet, Black, white, Hispanic, and otherwise, right? So like just the fact that there seems to be a plenitude of jobs doesn't mean that the folks that are there can get them, right? Like, you have to look at how we're criminalized, right? Like, just getting arrested for something that may have been a fine, that now you can't pay the fine, and so you can't get out of jail, and so you lose your job and you lose your children, or trying to find childcare. All of these are issues, right? So it's not just that jobs are available or that some city is, you know, providing some level of broadband or some level of transportation. You have to look at what the issues are that the people are really having and try to solve those issues. So if it's a matter of voting, then stop cutting voting hours, right? Stop saying that you can't take other people to the voting place, that you can't serve food while they're there. I mean, it's like these people want to say that if Black people would just vote, if you would stop making it difficult for Black people to vote, then maybe that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation now Lorena Roque. She's a senior policy analyst on the Racial Equity and Justice team at the Center for American Progress. Good morning and welcome, Lorena. Uh,
Thank you for having me.
I was looking at some of the reporting that your organization has done, and you found that the unemployment rate is across all demographics, and that, you know, Blacks with higher education, you know, levels are still less likely to be employed than whites with a lot less education. Help us understand those numbers. That was also pretty shocking.
Yeah, exactly. It is really shocking. And what we usually see with like employment discrimination is in recessions, Black workers are the first ones to get fired, and in a recovery, they are the last ones to get hired. So it's really, I mean, discrimination is one factor. And then another factor is the fact that, we still don't, the situation has not changed for a lot of Black families and people of color in this country. For instance, with schools being closed or being open and then unclosed with the Delta variant, some workers do not know if it's worth going back to work when they cannot afford affordable childcare, or be in a situation where it's stable and it makes sense to go to work and leave their children at school. Another factor is labor protections. Again, with the Delta variant, is that not every business, and mostly Black workers, are disproportionately seen in like lower wage jobs such as like leisure, hospitality, restaurants that we see in the district. And those jobs don't offer great labor protections. Not all of them have mask mandates or vaccine mandates, which I think also makes the Black labor market nervous, and the labor market in general nervous. So I think those are some of the factors as to why Black unemployment has been lagging.
Yeah, is that, Dr. Broady, what's happening with Black women? Because a lot of these studies really highlight that Black women in particular, is a particular demographic that is having a really difficult time in the labor market. We know that, the schools, opening, closing schools, parents, mothers in particular, being responsible for kids and for child care. And then Lorena mentioned those hospitality jobs where you often see African Americans concentrated. Is that what's happening to Black women, I would say, in this economy?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think about all of the places that I shop, be it the grocery store, or if I'm going to the post office, anytime I'm checking out, right? Like, I see Black women are overrepresented in those jobs. And yeah, customers don't have to have one mask in many places. Like, states are starting to do mask mandates again now, but they're interacting with these customers all day. And then you have some of the people who are rude about wearing a mask. So it's hard, and it's like, you're going to do this job in many cases that doesn't pay as much as it should, or as much as we would want it to. And it's like, can you even afford childcare to be able to go to work, right? Like, okay, so you have this job, but if you're not making enough an hour to cover the cost of childcare, then how do you go? Yeah. So I think all of these things we need to think about, particularly with respect to Black women who are getting the brunt of this.
Yeah, I know you've got to go, Dr. Broady, but just the last question for you. What's the solution? What do you see as the solution?
I think one of the solutions is, yes, we have these broad federal programs, but I think that there needs to be more done on looking at individual communities instead of just providing these broad solutions, to figure out what individual communities need in terms of voting rights, childcare, employment, healthcare, etc. And I think just from the news that I've seen, in many cases, we're going the wrong way. Like, I've read something that said if you get arrested in one city, and I'm trying not to be too specific on purpose, that you can't ride the metro anymore. Like, just getting arrested, not even convicted, right? Or another place where they're cutting down voting hours, right? Like, or the whole situation in Texas, period, right? So, like, with all of those things, we're moving in the wrong direction. We need to stop all of those things first, and then investigate what's needed in individual communities and start to help individual communities with policies for them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Broady, for your insights. Thank you for the work that you're doing at the Brookings Institute. Always a pleasure to see you, and thank you for sitting down with me this morning. Lorena, we're going to continue this conversation. July, we saw the what we thought was a drop. There was some excitement in July as the Black unemployment rate fell, but a lot of economists are saying, nothing really changed. You just, there are people who just stopped looking for jobs, and that's what impacted that number. So when we hear these job reports, what are we to think? I mean, are we to think that this is, these numbers are high because people have stopped looking for work, or is it because they can't find work, those that are seeking employment?
Definitely. I mean, in this past August jobs report, we actually saw the Black labor force, the amount of Black job seekers increase more substantially and proportionally to white workers or other people of color. And so really, it's not a fact that people aren't looking for work. In fact, it's the opposite. More people are looking for work, but simply cannot find those jobs, those, higher wage jobs and with more protections that can actually sustain their household.
Yeah, we saw, Lorena, billionaires, they got 1.8 trillion richer during this pandemic. I think it was Elon Musk, the owner of Tesla, who I think I read somewhere he got 600% richer during the pandemic. So this gross disparity where the billionaires are gaining 1.8 trillion in wealth, but yet we're seeing this Black unemployment rate and this widening disparity between the Black-white wealth gap. Do you see anything that's happening at the administration level that's really trying to address this? Because, where do we go if billionaires keep getting richer and poor people keep getting poorer? I mean, it's the gulf is just so wide.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that in order to close labor market gaps with the Black labor force and really narrow the racial wealth gap, it can't be just a one policy solution. Institutional and systemic racism has, been plagued by this country for centuries, and we really need an entire infrastructure of policies and the combination of policies to, really help the Black labor force and people of color. And so I think the Biden administration's infrastructure plan and the budget reconciliation on Build Back Better really sets a foundation of what we can achieve in combination. So one example is affordable access to childcare would really assure Black women that can, afford to get better jobs and have more stability. Also providing universal pre-K is in the infrastructure bill. So that also plays a substantial role. And things like having free tuition for the first 2 years of community college, all of these on top of each other need to be implemented together. It can't just be like, let's just take this piece and let's just take this piece and suddenly Black indicators are going to be great and just as amazing as the white labor force. And so I really think that, and even though if the Build Back Better plan and the infrastructure plan do get implemented, there are still more things that we need to do as a country and a policy perspective. For example, 50% of Black Americans are still unbanked and do not have access to banking. So really creating a postal banking system could be great for low income and communities of color.
I want to bring into the conversation now Markee Tate. He's the president of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. Good morning, Markee, and thanks for joining us. You're listening to this conversation. You represent employers. You represent companies, big and small, at the Chamber of Commerce. And it's really difficult when we hear employers saying they can't find workers. I was just at a hotel that said they can't even get to 100% occupancy because they can't staff up. But yet we have these high unemployment rates, particularly amongst African Americans, people of color, yet employers are saying, I can't operate my restaurant, I can't operate my hotel because I cannot find enough employees. Well, something's off there. Help us understand that.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for having me, Areva. Definitely enjoying this conversation and listening. And the one thing behind the issues in the Black community is it starts with policy. When you have policy that specifically is geared towards Black people, you see a lot of success in the job markets, in the health markets, in all the markets out here. So, but I would say, Black people are heavily within the service industry, the hospitality, construction, agriculture, traditionally speaking. And when you look at, I heard you all talk about the 1972 is when they started actually measuring Black unemployment. And it's the same as it was in 1972. I know there's been a few studies up from 72 to 2019 that, Black unemployment has always been at least double the white unemployment and regular unemployment. So I think there needs to be some specific policy solutions that's going to help that cause for helping Black people. That we're in a rut when it comes to wages, when it comes to Black wealth, when it comes to the racial wealth gap. There has to be specific solutions that are coming out. Even when you look at the budget reconciliation bill, you look at all the bills that are coming out. We need our own set asides in each and every economic bill coming out to get the Black community out of this rut that we're in.
And I hear you on the policy point, Markee, and I don't disagree with that. Obviously, this is going to take what Biden calls a whole of government, I'll call a whole of society approach. But what about employers? How is it that, we have restaurants that say they cannot open, hotels cannot get to full capacity, businesses, are crying about not finding workers, but Black workers are saying we're out there looking for jobs and we are not getting hired. So if you're serious as a business and you want to open 7 days a week, why aren't you hiring some of these Black people who are saying they're looking for jobs but can't find them?
Well, I look at a lot of reports from even the Center for Immigration Studies, Economic Policy, Lorena's group also, and I know AFL-CIO chief strategist or chief economist William Spriggs basically said it has to do with discrimination. I mean, out there is Black people looking for these jobs, but they're looking over us in all cases, in all sectors of all industries. And the numbers, the data actually show that. I mean, if you look at the latest data that we're talking about, we're well above. The other groups actually went down in unemployment. Blacks actually went up in unemployment. The only thing that I can attribute is basically what William Spriggs said. It's discrimination in the workplace because we are out there looking for those jobs. If you think about the Black businesses, Lorena is right, Black businesses are over 90% are self-employed. That has some historical discrimination with that too. We don't have enough money to invest in our business due to the wealth levels in our community. There's some historical reasons why that is that way. And I think the numbers show why that's there.
Lorena, do you agree with Markee that and you're right. I've been reading William Spriggs, he, former Howard professor, now at union leader, and he's been very vocal. And he says, Look, we can look at all the numbers, we can look at all the studies, but at the end of the day, it's just plain old discrimination.
Right.
I would definitely agree with Markee, but also I think it's important to talk about how unemployment insurance has really given workers and workers of color the ability to look for higher wage jobs. I think the Black labor force is looking for jobs that have a higher wage, right, to support their households. The pandemic just exacerbated these issues that we've had for decades in this country. And so I just think that unemployment insurance has really given them the ability to demand higher wages. And if employers cannot find workers, then that means they're not setting a competitive wage, they're not setting competitive labor protections. Demanding a higher wage, especially in the Black community, is not a bad thing.
And I'm glad you mentioned unemployment, because we can't have this conversation without talking about those benefits. The original, the first COVID relief bill gave an additional $600 a week on top of whatever the state paid in unemployment benefits, and then that was reduced to $300, and the time frame for unemployment extended, substantially, I think to 78, 79 weeks. But Markee, a lot of red states said that was the problem. They said people were at home collecting that unemployment insurance and they didn't want to go to work. And some states, terminated their benefits earlier than they were set to expire. They just expired, over the weekend on Labor Day. But some red states, Ohio, I talked to a friend in Ohio, said it was June. She got notice that she was getting her last COVID relief, bump, that $300 bump. What happened in Georgia, and are your employers that you represent, are they of that frame of mind that these unemployment benefits are the culprit?
Yeah, but if you think about the unemployment benefits and the amount that you were receiving in unemployment, over $800. So you have 21% of Black America is living in poverty. So and a lot of them are working those low wage jobs. And if you experience somewhat closer to a living wage of over $800 a week when you were making $300 or $400 a week, that actually changes your mindset to say, hey, if I can make this amount on just unemployment, I can make a lot more in these service industry jobs that we're in. So it's all about raising those wages to a livable or closer to a livable wage. And that's what Black workers are actually looking for, a livable wage.
Question, Markee, do you believe you're speaking for your organization and the employers that you represent, that those benefits were a disincentive, that $800 you talked about for some people, like if you lived in California, our unemployment benefits, when the $600 bump was available, there were people who were literally getting $1,200, $1,400 a week, state benefit plus the COVID additional benefit. Do you believe those benefits were causing people to drop out of the labor force, stop looking for jobs, and just say, hey, I'm a cruise on these unemployment benefits?
I mean, I think that was a small part of it, but generally speaking, Black people are hardworking people. We're honest. We want a livable wage. We want to be there for that employer, particularly Black businesses. Black businesses, closed over 41% closed during the beginning stages of the pandemic, and a lot of that was due to no customers were coming in. So, but yes, I do agree with what you're saying.
Well, I'm not saying it. I'm asking the question. And Lorena, I know your organization has studied this extensively. This is a Republican talking point. This isn't a Areva point. I agree with you. Black people are hardworking and want to go to work. Yes, there probably were, some small percentage of people who decided to stop looking to draw the unemployment benefits. I don't think that, is nearly as large of a group as the media, particularly, conservative media painted. So Lorena, you guys do the research. What does the research tell us about the impact of those benefits on the labor market?
Sure. Research shows that unemployment workers who receive unemployment insurance actually look for jobs the most. So I think that, really conservative talking points of I completely disagree with on how unemployment insurance is just a way to get by. They know that it's still not a livable wage or a sustainable wage, and it's not really that's what all the numbers tell us, that it doesn't really disincentivize workers, Black workers primarily, from looking for work. And at the end of the day, it is about wages. The minimum wage does not increase in a very long time. It's still $7.25, and that's also not a livable wage. So I think that just fits in perfectly with the research that Black workers are looking for jobs. They are not relying on employment insurance, but they're demanding higher wage jobs.
And Markee, are you seeing that employers are responding? Yes. So Lorena just, dispelled the myth that people were just at home, chilling out, getting their unemployment benefits, not looking for work. But, and that they're demanding. They realize that, that they were worth more and should be earning more. Are you finding that employers are getting that message that to bring people back to work, people don't want to work for $9 an hour? They cannot support their families. They can't pay their rent. They can't buy food on those low wages. Are employers responding? We've seen some big chains. I think I've seen help wanted signs for fast food chains where now they're paying. I think I saw one. They were paying the employee, the crew worker, $16, but then they offered $18 for a manager. So I'm thinking, a manager to manage your restaurant, you want to give them $2 more. Do you know what it takes to manage a group of people? So I'm not sure employers are getting the message that these low wages are a thing of the past for a lot of employees.
Yeah, in general, I think the employees are getting the message because, as you stated, you see incentives for hiring, you see some hiring bonuses, you see higher wages that they're actually promoting, particularly in the fast food industry. I mean, you drive by fast foods and you see help wanted signs, and also under the help wanted signs or hiring signs, you see incentives for bonuses, hiring bonuses. So yes, I think they're looking at meeting the needs of the actual workers that are coming in to seek those jobs in the Black community. It's just that, as a business owner, you definitely have to look at that profit margin and see how profitable that you're going to be in waging those wages. But you got to, I guess, the employees need to look at, not having those employees who can work for them and getting those customers in and actually making revenue. and that equals a higher wage.
And I'm glad you mentioned, profit margin for companies. But what we saw, Markee, is billionaires in particular, and of course, this isn't all business owners, but that, salaries and bonuses and compensation increased for lots of CEOs, lots of C-suite professionals. And then these billionaires like Elon Musk, got super rich to the extent you can even become, I guess they call them now the ultra rich. So is that just a myth, Lorena, that's perpetuated that somehow businesses don't have the margins, they don't have the spread between, what it costs to operate their business and the profit they have to, return to their shareholders? Because all of a sudden now, Walmart and some of these other big companies have realized, maybe we can pay you $15. But what's different? Maybe we can pay you $18 an hour. How do we dispel that myth that somehow these companies don't have the margins to pay higher wages to their, workers who basically make their businesses work?
Sure. And I mean, I think this is a huge problem for just like market capitalization. In the US right now, 1 in every 4 worker is an Amazon worker and really has low wages and no labor protections. And I just think that
1 in 4 people in the US work for Amazon? Wow.
Okay. Which is wild. And it goes to show that big corporations really just profit and like move the system for their favor. A really big example that really hits and hurts Black workers and Black Americans in this country, and that corporations take advantage of, is the tax system. Everyone here in this talk right now pays more taxes than Amazon and pays more taxes than Tesla and Elon Musk. And so when it's Black workers who get audited by the IRS for, getting their child tax credit every month, $300 a month, just so they can support their child and support their family and their household. And so really these systems are being set up and that these corporations lobby for in Congress for the system to work in their favor. So I definitely don't think that these corporations are really concerned with their profit margins. I mean, they are concerned with that to the extent that they want to make $1 billion more for themselves and really exploit Black workers and workers of color for everything that they can.
Yeah, they want to make $1 billion on the backs of low wage earners. And I'm glad you mentioned the tax code, Markee. One of the things that Biden, in talking about the disappointing August jobs report, is, he blamed it on Delta variant, but he also says, look, we got a problem with our tax code. Billionaires and corporations don't pay their fair share. And a part of his, Build Back Better plan is to increase taxes on what he calls the ultra rich. And he said, don't worry, you'll still get to keep your 3 houses. So we're not going to strip you from your luxury, but we are going to raise taxes on folks who make over $400,000 and on corporations. Do you think that's the right solution?
Well, I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, because if you look at, billionaires, what you stated, $1.8 trillion in wealth over the period of that transition. And that's going to affect that tax rate. Cutting that tax rate is going to affect that. But I know some of the problems, even though I'm definitely pro corporations, but there are some issues within that. When you look at how much they're paying in taxes, how much the billionaires pay in taxes, they pay at a lower tax rate than somebody like myself that's at the lower end of the spectrum. So that, policy is going to have to help correct the situation that we're in now. I don't think the market is going to correct itself on its own. It's going to take some policy such as what President Biden is actually talking about.
Do you think that policy, Lorena, the Build Back Better, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, where Biden talks about the infrastructure bill creating more jobs that will pay $20 and $21 an hour, even for those workers who don't have college, degrees, that you'll be able to, with a GED or high school education, be able to get some of those jobs. Do you think that's going to do enough? Because when we talk about the unemployment rate, obviously that leads us to conversations about the wealth gap. But do you think the policy, we're going to have to start having that conversation about reparations if we're ever going to see African Americans close the gap that obviously just keeps growing. It has been growing since this has been tracked by the Labor Bureau back in 1972.
Sure. So I definitely think that the Build Back Better plan and the infrastructure plan are a very good start and a very good foundational start for narrowing the racial wealth gap. But ultimately, with the Biden administration implementing the expanded child tax credit, it really opens up conversations to exactly what you're talking about. Something like a universal basic income or reparations, really at least the beginning, right? Like HR 40, studying reparations, because ultimately, and I'm going to go back to the tax system, is supposed to be a system of kind of like redistributing resources if it's done right. And as we just talked about, that does not happen. So we really need to take more steps if we're really going to right the wrongs of our history and racism.
What do you think, Markee? Do you think that employers, chambers of commerce like yours, can get behind, HR 40, which is really just about studying the impact of reparations? It's not about advancing or making reparations available. But do you think that's something that you could see employers getting behind? Seems like we've had like Jamie Simon and some of these other CEOs of big corporations have had a moment after George Floyd. They've become woke, I guess you can say. And recognizing that the system is so distorted that something has to be done.
Yes, I definitely agree. Something that has to be done. You mentioned HR 40. HR 40 is definitely the way to get Blacks out of this rut that we're in. If you think about the racial wealth gap and where it's at, it's a very large gulf of the racial wealth gap. And the only thing that's going to solve that is a multi-generational reparations program. But if you look at reparations actually being instituted in America, that's actually good for America, that we close that racial wealth gap between Blacks and whites that live in this country. And from studies, just like Citigroup has a study out of closing the racial inequality gaps in housing, education, health, that's actually reparations. That's going to increase the GDP by 4 or 5%. And you're adding about $16 trillion into the system. That's going to help all of America. So I'm a very big proponent of a multi-generational reparations program for the American descendants of slavery. Definitely so.
Great. And glad to hear that, Mark, and glad to hear that we could, Chamber of Commerce that's traditionally pro-business would get behind that. Lorena, I will ask you about this moment. I've been having a lot of conversation on the special report about whether what happened after George Floyd was a moment or a movement. We've talked about it in terms of equity in the workplace, diversity and inclusion, but I don't think we can have the conversation about the Black unemployment rate rising in August without talking about what we saw employers come out and say right after George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020, which was all of these resources were going to be deployed towards, racial justice causes. And we know that there was, I think I saw 50 billion or so was pledged to work on this issue of racial justice. But how come we're not seeing that commitment, those commitments from those companies translate as it relates to this unemployment, this rising unemployment number for Blacks? Right. I would expect to see some correlation, like, hey, companies are saying, we want to address racial justice. We want to, make the workplace more equitable. Let's go out and hire a bunch of more Black people.
Right. And I think it's really interesting to make that connection about corporations really being like, okay, we're going to be race forward and we're going to include diversity and inclusion. But diversity and inclusion is not the same as equity. It's like diversity is we'll bring you into the room. Equity is we will pay you the same as other folks in the room. And so I really think that, and I think other government programs in the past have wanted to kind of this concept of just throwing money at the problem, right? Like these place-based, we're going to really help quote unquote disadvantaged communities, but the money doesn't ever actually go to the people that would really benefit from that. So I really think that, if corporations really want to take a stand and be with racial justice and really prove that George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement is a movement and not a moment, then they really need to start actually promoting equity in those corporations and not just inviting people to sit at the table, but really inviting them to speak.
Yeah, and Markee, one of the things we saw this weekend, Labor Day weekend, those benefits we've been talking about, they ended. What Biden said, to states was, he says, look, states, we gave you a bunch of federal money. You can decide to give extra benefits to your residents if you choose to. States like California, they've been giving their own form of COVID relief. I think, up to $600 for certain families. But then Ted Cruz over the weekend said something. He said, look, basically, stop whining. All you people that have been getting unemployment, go get a job. It's simple. He kind of tongue in cheek. What do you say to people like Ted Cruz who think this is just as simple as go out and look for a job? Basically saying, get off your lazy ass is what he's really saying, and find a job because they're out there if you want it. What do you say to someone like Ted Cruz?
Well, I think someone like Ted Cruz has a misunderstanding of what's going on in America. I mean, if you look at the data, you look at the Black community, Black people are going out looking for jobs. They're not just sitting at home. We are a very hardworking culture of people. But when you have somebody that says language like Ted Cruz, they're just not looking at reality. They're living in another world, it seems like. So I don't understand why someone would say that when they can look at all you need to do is look at the data, look at the unemployment data, look at any data that's related to the Black community, and you see disparities all over, from health disparities to educational disparities to funding of our schools and in our communities. It's all on paper. It's simple, but the solutions is what we truly need. The Washington Post actually did a study. They produced actually last week on the $50 billion that were given out after the unfortunate incident with George Floyd. And what it was lacking was policy. The money does help, but if it comes without the public policy to help enforce laws to help Black people, it's not for nothing, but it's not as effective. We need that public policy for our community to move forward. And that public policy, we actually mentioned a few moments ago, it actually starts with policies that were strictly made to actually help Black people. When we look at policies that are coming down from economic policies, from the state level to the local to the federal level, if it doesn't address the issues that are specifically that are happening in Black America, it doesn't really help. It doesn't really help us. So we need specific solutions that's going to help us in all of these racial gaps that we actually see based on this data.
Okay, last question for you, Lorena. We know this president has said that, he's looking through everything in terms of his policy making through a racial justice lens. We know that he has a domestic advisor, that is, again, his whole of government approach is looking at all of these racial justice issues. I'm sure his team wasn't too pleased with those job numbers, not too pleased to hear that the Black unemployment rate is rising. What do if you had a crystal ball, the next job report that comes out that's going to tell us what happened, for job numbers in terms of job creation, as well as the unemployment rate for African Americans, are we going to see a continuing increase, you think, in that unemployment rate for Blacks, or are we going to see a leveling off?
If I had a crystal ball, I mean, obviously not even economists predict these things accurately, but I think we're going to continue to see a lot of hesitancy from Black labor market. And in terms of Black unemployment, I don't think it will steady off. Hopefully it does. But I just think that with the uncertainty in the economy right now with the Delta variant, it's just a very uncertain time. And it's also very uncertain, as I mentioned, for families with children. We don't know if schools are going to remain open or remain closed. And so if they remain closed, like how will workers go back to work when their child cannot, have childcare? So I hope that I'm wrong, and I hope that it does steady, and that we institute like very rapid policy in the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better plan to really help families get by and really start to actually make this a recovery for everyone.
And for you, Markee, you work with a lot of employers. Give us some advice. Anybody out there that's looking for a job, that's, banging their head up against the wall because it's been 3 months, it's been 6 months. And we know the longer you are unemployed, the more difficult it gets to become employed because of that gap in your resume. But for anyone that's out there that's struggling to find a job, what advice do you have for them?
I would say don't give up. I mean, there's opportunity out there. Black businesses are looking for workers as we speak right now. The market is going to turn. However, we do need that policy push to help those job seekers that are out there that particularly look like me, that are in our community, because we know that there's discrimination going on with the numbers, but just keep your head up. It's going to be a better day. We're actually out here supporting our Black businesses to make sure we create opportunities as a chamber for our Black businesses so they can increase their revenue, so they can hire more people from our community.
Great advice. Definitely don't give up. And I'll add, as a lawyer, if you feel like you've been discriminated against in the application of a job, that's a violation of federal law. So don't hesitate to report it to your local EEOC office, because employment discrimination doesn't just start when you're on a job. The law prohibits employment discrimination even in the seeking of a job. It may not result in you getting that job, but it might cause that employer to change their policies and how they go about hiring. Again, great conversation. Thank you so much, Lorena. Thank you, Markee. Always good to see you. Appreciate the work that both of you are doing on this really important issue. And all I'm going to say is we're going to watch this space. That job report will be out in a couple of weeks. So we'll see what happens to this unemployment rate for African Americans. Hopefully we get some better news in the September jobs report. But again, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of my guests this morning. I started this conversation by saying these numbers were depressing. And yes, when you hear that the Black unemployment rate is, twice as high as the white unemployment rate, and that rate continues to be that high, it is depressing. But I feel like I'm a little happier. I'm ending on a more positive note. There are jobs out there. There are employers who are looking for people to hire. Obviously employees, or those who are seeking to become employees, have to be diligent, have to be tenacious in your job search. Oftentimes it's just a numbers game. You have to fill out a ton of applications, and you have to keep your spirits up and not get too discouraged when you get turned down for a job. But I'll say to those employers who are saying that they cannot find employees, know that there are employees who are out there looking for jobs. But you can't continue, to do business as you did pre-COVID. Employees are looking for incentives. They're looking for higher wages. They're looking for better working conditions. They're looking for protection. They're looking for protection in the workplace. So if you are an employer, think about your wage. Have you increased your wages? Have your wages kept up? Think about the benefits that you offer. Are you offering health benefits? Are you offering flexible time? Are you allowing your employees, if possible, to work from home, to telecommute, to have the time off that they may need to care for their children, or to make sure their kids are in school? So this is going to be a two-way proposition. We can obviously change some of these structural issues. Obviously, we're not going to change discrimination overnight. We're not going to change structural racism overnight. But businesses want to make money. And to make money, you need workers. You need employees. And there are Black workers that are out there looking for jobs. So hopefully, employers will start to give a second look to these workers and start to think more seriously about hiring Black workers, because all the studies show they're not at home, Ted Cruz, sitting on their butts, depending on unemployment benefits. People want to work. They want to get back to the workforce. They want to be fulfilled. They want to be productive. It's just a matter of having an opportunity to do so. So again, those folks that are out there, don't give up. There's a job out there with your name on it. Trust me. Some words to live by before I get out. Senior statesman and congressman from South Carolina, James Clyburn, said this, and I think what he said was so profound that I wanted to share it with you. This is what he said. He said, people love to quote John F. Kennedy's famous line, "A rising tide lifts all boats." Now, Clyburn went on to say, it lifts all the boats that got solid bottoms. If the bottoms got holes in them, or if the boats have deteriorated, a rising tide ain't gonna lift them. Let me translate that for you. What Clyburn was really saying was a better U.S. economy, i.e. the rising tide, is not going to help Black folks, i.e. lift our boats, because fundamentally our boats have lots of holes in them. And those holes are called racism. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask, and don't forget we are all in this together.